And now I'd like to introduce our presenter today, which is my colleague, Holly Ryder-Milkovich. And for those of you who don't know Holly, she is a Senior Director of Prevention Education here at EVERFI. Previously, Holly directed the Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center at the University of Michigan and has provided expertise to President Obama's White House Task Force on best practices for campus-based sexual and intimate partner violence prevention and response efforts, and has also represented 4-year colleges and universities in the Federal Negotiated Rulemaking Committee for the 2013 Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. Holly brings to the table over 2 decades of experience in violence prevention and response and in higher education, and that is what her role at EVERFI entails. I'd also like to mention very briefly that this webinar is a rerun of a presentation that already delivered at our CPN Summit just last June in Boston. And we know that there might be some of you that have already participated and attended the presentation. There will be slight readaptations and a few updates, but all in all, most of the content will be repeated. So by all means, if you'd like to sit again and listen to the presentation again, we're super happy to have you, but we just wanted to let you know that it is in part a rerun. And now, without further ado, Holly, I'd like to kick it off to you so you can deliver today's presentation. Can you hear us?
Thank you so much, Michele, and I am thrilled to be joining folks online, those whom I had the pleasure to interact with in Boston in June, and then the very many of you who are joining for the first time. This is an exciting opportunity to really look at what 2016, 2017 has told us from the big picture level about sexual assault efforts, prevention, and response on college campuses. So let's go ahead and get started here. We'll move forward. We're going to start by engaging you folks with a really quick weather report. So go ahead and weigh in. If you could launch the first poll, Michele, to let folks weigh in on what was your campus like this year. Okay, so poll is, so was it sunny, business as usual? Did you have a partly cloudy kind of year, some disruption on campus, but nothing that you weren't prepared for? Did you have some thunderstorms, whether they brewed for a long time and suddenly erupted or came up out of the blue, that significant unrest that happened on college campuses, or foggy? You had the benefit of being on sabbatical. Okay, so we've had about 64, 65% of you vote. Let's go ahead and get up to 70%. We'll close the poll here. Okay, almost there. Thank you so much for those of you who have already chimed in. All right, maybe, and great. If you could go ahead and close the poll, Michele, with 70% of you chiming in, it looks like for the majority of you, there was some disruption on campus, nothing you were prepared for, but for many of you, a full 20%, there was some significant disruption on campus. I think that we can all be jealous of the folks who had the benefit of being on sabbatical, those 2% of you joining us. But let's go ahead and move on. I can tell you that as I've thought myself about this next year, I wondered, and this is the moment, what I felt like on the November after election, as I felt as though, holy moly, what had happened? Suddenly, what I thought was clear sailing, everything had been disrupted, and that there was going to be potentially and almost probably a lot of change on the horizon. But as I continued to reflect on it, I realized that it's really, for me anyway, short-sighted to think about that one day of the year being that shock to our system. As we can see here, there have been a lot of turmoil on college campuses related to safe space safe conversations, related to trigger warning conversations, that these issues have been percolating on campus far before the election, and they're continuing to percolate. And so why am I talking about these issues? For me, it's important that we're contextualizing the work that we're doing in this larger frame, because, you know, inevitably these conversations are involve fundamental questions about respect, about how students are going to speak to each other and treat each other, how they're going to address concerns and disagreements. And so, you know, this is really an important part of that backdrop story that we're looking at. But what are actual students experiencing, and how has this exceptional political moment of the year impacted them? How do they think of themselves and their relationships to each other? You know, these are fundamental questions that I want for us to ask. And so you see at the top of this slide information from the most recent SERP survey about the 2016 entering student class. So these are those first-time, full-time students. And I'm encouraged by some of the information that we see here, that we have strong agreement from incoming students about their willingness to see the world from other perspectives and to negotiate controversial issues. I think that willingness to see the world from other individuals' perspectives has some important implications for us, especially as it relates to, for example, bystander intervention or consent. Being willing to look at someone else's perspective can help with imagining how someone else might wish to be treated, both in a situation of potential harm or in a romantic situation. And I think, you know, especially when we look at that see the world from others' perspective, a place where we have significant agreement among men, that there is an opportunity also for empathy building here as it relates to identifying ways that we can support individuals on campus who have experienced harm. But we also see at the bottom that there is, we also see at the bottom that we have students that the last year has really had an impact on their worldview, and that we have, you know, from the SERP authors themselves, one of the most politicized student bodies that arrived on our campus in the last year. I expect that this orientation towards the world is likely to shape their time on campus, and of course, as those students engage with others coming after them, shape what's happening on our campuses in general for the next coming years. So then let's change and look more specifically. We looked before at attitudes in general of those incoming students, thinking about how this has shaped the last year. Let's look more specifically now at those sexual assault attitudes that are identified by gender. I will be talking a little bit more about students who are gender nonconforming, who identify as trans, or who choose not to identify as gender. But I'm going to look specifically at men and women in this slide. This is data from the EVERFI Haven survey. This is from the second survey. So for those of you who are using the Haven course, this is information that you would have also for your own campus specifically. And you'll note here that all of these data points we're at strongly agree. What we see also is that, you know, I would respect the person who took action to prevent sexual assault, and I would respect the person who made sure they asked for and received consent. Interestingly, those two pieces, we have a discrepancy between, you know, individuals who would respect the person and individuals who would ask for and receive consent. A discrepancy I identify because, of course, asking for consent in a sexual situation is, in fact, taking action to prevent a sexual assault. And so I'm really interested in the fact that we do have this discrepancy. And it could be a place for us to consider additional action as it relates to breaking down what is acceptable and not acceptable in a public sphere versus in a private sphere, and really honing in on that consent education, which tells us that we have a little bit more room to go here. I'm going to note also that as we're looking at as we're looking at this slide, we see clear verbal and sober permission is the best way to make sure a person's okay with sexual activity. And then we see a drop here, that a person who is drinking and is sexually assaulted is never at fault for what happened to them. So we see a discrepancy here for both men and for women. But that we see a greater discrepancy among men in this area. And for me, this is a place for us to really think about ways in which alcohol expectancies are playing a role in sexual assault attitudes. Now, these are, again, for those students who have completed the Haven course. So these are for many of us on campuses, those first-year students. I think that this is an important place to look at the way in which perceptions around alcohol are shifting understandings of students around who is responsible for getting consent and when consent is able to be given. I'm going to move now and look at more information as it relates to those incoming students. And so one of the things that we are able to do here at EVERFI, because we have 1,800 campus partners and over 5 million student learners, we're looking here across our entire sample. And what we're identifying is that we have lots of students who are arriving on campus having already, unfortunately, experienced unwanted sexual contact and partner abuse. Oftentimes, this information is presented as divided between men and women. What we did here with the benefit of our larger data set is to really break this out and look across the spectrum of gender identities. And once we disaggregate that information from and share additional information about our students who identify as other than as man or as woman, we see that there are significantly discrepant areas. And so what we see here is that trans men and students who identify as genderqueer have much higher rates of previous victimization than do some of our other student populations. And so thinking about this information, being able to get down into the nitty-gritty of our campus data allows us to think about what are some ways in which we can really be seeking to not only be addressing that universal student population, but also taking this information to tailor programming that's going to be specifically identifying those students who are at greater risk. I'm just going to note here, one of the pieces of data that I think is worth exploring further, which is that the students who identify as trans female are coming in with lower rates of victimization. I just want to note that in the non-student or general population of the U.S., trans women are at much accelerated risk for experiencing victimization, especially trans women of color. And so this data is really doesn't align with the data in the larger population. I think that there's probably a number of important reasons for that, one of which being that the age at which individuals may self-identify and place on a survey that they identify as trans female tends to be a bit older. I think what is probably also a very important factor here is that we're simply not seeing as many students who are trans female arrive on our campuses. They're, I imagine, likely not getting to our college campuses, and our campuses are not enriched by their presence. Well, that's all stuff I was supposed to identify earlier, but here we go. You know, continuing to look at this information, and again, thinking about what happens when we disaggregate that sort of larger set of information to look at particular identities for students. I'm going to look now at students who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or as well as heterosexual. And we can see here that for these students that we often lump LGB all together, but when we disaggregate that information, we see that students who are bisexual and students who are queer are at are much more likely to have already experienced harm before they arrive on campus than students with any other sexual orientation. And we'll see that the same is true here when we're looking at students' racial or ethnic identifications. That we know that students of color are at higher risk for experiencing sexual assault prior or once they are on our campus. But when we're looking at experiences prior to arrival on campus, again, disaggregating that population, we see that Native Hawaiian, American Indians, and Alaskan Native students have a greater likelihood of having experienced violence. And this, for me, drives home that really important point that Kimberly Crenshaw notes when she says that intersectionality posits that the myriad systems of stigma and discrimination combine and interact to confer disproportionate risk among populations with marginalized social identities. And so as we're thinking about, how do we look at that, we look at our students with that lens of intersectionality, this is an important point to make, that we have multiple identities that are conferring different kinds of risks on our students and that are shaping how students arrive on campus. And all of this is really, for me, drives home that point that, we know that our students come to campus with that sort of slate well inscribed. The tabula rasa myth has been buried for a really long time. But I think that there's a lot of work for us to do as a group of professionals in thinking more about those experiences that students have prior to arrival on campus. So what you see here on the screen is a lot of information about those adverse childhood experiences. So we've shared information already about students who have arrived on campus already having experienced dating violence, domestic violence, or some form of sexual violence. And we know additionally that other kinds of experiences will also increase the likelihood of students experiencing victimization on our campuses. I think that going forward, it's going to be important for us as a community of practitioners to think about how can we take into account, learn more information about those adverse childhood experiences that our students are arriving on our campus with to help shape our sexual violence prevention programs to be effective for all students, but also to help share that information with our colleagues across campus as they're framing out the work that they're doing with students to really support their overall health and well-being as well as their academic success. And of course, we know that once those students arrive on our doorsteps, that they're most often being dropped off by parents. And yet, the data that I'm going to share from you next comes from this really great new study called The Talk out of the Harvard School of Education. And in that study, they identified a number of different ways in which parents are not having the conversations that we need for them to have in order to partner with us on these issues. So we see here that fewer than half of parents are having conversations with their young people about being sure that their partner wants to have sex and is comfortable doing so before having sex, not pressuring someone to have sex with you, not continuing to ask someone to have sex after they have said no. Right at the foundation of our work, fewer than half of parents are having those conversations with their young people. So this is, for me, the absolute best case that I can have for developing strong parent communication programs. And I would love to see more campuses starting that parent communication program about the kinds of conversations they want parents to have with their students to prepare them for success at the prospect stage as they're arriving for those visit programs, framing that conversation in terms of what are our community expectations, what kind of a student is a good fit for our campus, and how can you as a parent really ensure a student's success. Certainly, we know that parents have an important role in shaping the choices that students make as it relates to sexual activity, as well as, of course, as it relates to alcohol consumption. And I think that it's really important that we help parents partner with us by providing strong guidance for them, talking points, and reminding them of the important continuing role that they play. And so for me, it really boils down to, this amazing quote, and this comes from the talk as well, that, when we look at our institutional missions and we see the language of preparing the next generation, preparing graduates for success, creating the future leaders of the world, that fundamentally that also includes preparing them to have those healthy, respectful, meaningful, sustaining relationships of all kinds. And so the work that we do as it relates to sexual violence prevention and supporting healthy sexuality and healthy relationships is absolutely at the heart of the academic enterprise, which is one of the reasons why our work is so urgent. So then let's look a little bit further and think about how these issues are playing out in the prevention realm. So for those of you who may have tuned into other kinds of EVERFI efforts, you'll know that we really see prevention as a process here, that we're looking at institutionalization, ways in which the institution itself is supporting strong prevention efforts through their visibility of senior leadership, through ways in which they align their resources to support prevention, both in persons and in dollars, the ways in which the work of prevention is embedded into the important initiatives of the institution. We look at critical processes. How is the work being evaluated? How is that information being shared with key stakeholders, including those senior administrators, students, other campus partners, parents? What kinds of policies undergird that work? And then finally, at the very tip, where some people start with prevention, we see this as the tip of the spear, that programming, the work that we're doing across all populations to create the kinds of changes in knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs that we know are going to transform our college campuses. All right, so let's dive in and think about these issues and look at the progress that we've made in the past year as it relates to institutionalization, sort of writ large. So this information coming from the Association of American Universities report is positive, that we do see spending increases in these areas, in student training, in faculty and staff training, and in victim support. This report identifies that 250 plus FTE were added across the respondents of the AAU report. I would expect that most of those folks are probably related more on the response side than on the prevention side, and I'll get to that theory in just a minute. But that's a positive. Now, on the other hand, despite that increase in spending, I want to share this information, which is coming from the aggregate data from our sexual assault diagnostic inventory that has been now done by nearly 100 campuses. And when we look at that prevention spending in dollars per student, we see that even the campus that has the highest amount of spending is still spending at a much lower level than is likely to be effective for the kinds of issues that we're trying to solve. I mean, $5.57, I'm embarrassed to say that I definitely bought a coffee that cost more than $5.57, and yet even for our campuses that are doing the most work in this area, that's what they're spending on prevention per student each year. So let's look at that a little further. When we're looking at FTE, again, thinking about, we saw earlier that campuses are reporting that they're increasing FTE, but we're seeing that those increases are likely still need to happen in the area of prevention. So our small campuses are doing the best, as our sexual assault diagnostic inventory identifies, with 1 FTE for every 4,000 students. Our medium and our larger campuses, based on the sheer scope of their campuses, fare much less well in this era. When we have anywhere from one prevention professional working with 10,000 students for our large campuses to one prevention professional focusing on 20,000 students. And so when we think about all of those, floor level expectations that the legislation, both national, federal and state legislation have laid out, it's hard to imagine, that any one person can do the best work that they are capable of doing when they are needing to serve 19,000 students per person. So this is an area that we need to continue to do a lot of work on. For our campuses that have achieved the advanced status in our sexual assault diagnostic inventory, we see that it's 1 FTE for every 1,200, a little over 1,200 students. And so this is more at the level that we expect for campuses to be able, again, to do their very best work possible. We see increases in the amount of visible presidential leadership, and here I'm referencing absolutely college president leadership. It did not get enough attention in January when it was released, but the final White House report that I've noted here is really all about the ways in which that senior leadership on every college campus is the driver of change when it comes to sexual violence prevention. So we have some information that tells us that, the majority of college presidents are speaking 4 or more times in the last year. Or rather 3 or more times in the last year. And for our advanced institutions, they're speaking 4 or more times in the last year. This is a really positive trend because, as we know, college presidents set the agenda for the college campus. And so when they are talking about this issue publicly, they're making it clear to all of their constituencies that this is a priority, and there is much more willingness to align all kinds of resources to help support this effort. I think that a lot of the academic freedom discourse that we have heard and that I referenced in the beginning of my talk is also a sign of progress. So too often there's this false equivalency set between preparing all students to succeed, even those students who have experienced trauma, or protecting academic freedom. I think that this is a false dichotomy, and that we can help disrupt this false dichotomy by first sticking a dagger into the heart of the term trigger warning, which has too often been misapplied, which is a red flag for all kinds of concerns that it's not intended to address. And that really doesn't help us understand what it is that we need to be doing to help all students succeed. What we've seen over the last year is that when we look at really honing in on that pedagogical approach as it relates to looking at not trigger warnings, but rather the kinds of context notices or content notices that many faculty routinely give and that students have come to understand as a part of their learning experience helps prepare all students to be able to achieve. I'm going to say also that I am excited about the fact that we're having these conversations. Academia is so much about disruption and the competition of ideas. And at the core of it, we are actually talking about the ways in which issues in the classroom impact student well-being and impact student learning. And that's a conversation that we weren't even having at all, even 5 years ago, let alone now. So I see this as a really positive additional forward motion. All right, so moving forward, we see also that there is increased transparency for campuses. So this is information that's coming from a study that L.B. Klein and Jill Dunlap did, as well as some information from the White House Task Force. And we can see that campuses are really doing a great job at sharing more information with their students on, some of the most prevalent ways in which students receive information, those campus websites. So lots more information about reporting, information about how to report, information about, law enforcement, directing users to on-campus confidential resources, all are really positive forward motion. And there is still place to go. So, we can see here that fewer than half of campuses that were reviewed in this study are not explaining confidentiality versus privacy when reporting to Title IX. I point this out because this is so important to ensuring that students have enough information to be able to make an informed choice, and so that the student has the best opportunity to be able to have an experience that they have chosen, and it also sets campuses up for success as well. This is something that I think that we can do more work in the future. 36% provided anonymous reporting options, seeing that increase so that more students on campuses across the country had more opportunities to anonymously report information is going to increase the amount of information about college campuses to what's happening on college campuses so that they can do more. I'll note that this is something, even though we're in what feels like the waning moments of summer already, that it's still time for you to do an audit of your own website on your campus, potentially using some of this information to help guide what kinds of information you include on your campus, how many clicks it takes to get to that information, and how you might be able to share that information in a more cohesive way with your students. Okay, moving on to critical processes here. So again, critical processes are looking at how campuses are assessing efficacy of their work, whether they're reviewing policies on a regular basis, how they're developing those policies, whether or not they're doing strategic planning, how they're gathering information about their campus. All of those pieces are really about critical processes, or as I like to call it, the brain of the work that's happening. So looking here, we see then that as we're measuring progress on campus, again, I'm going to note that this 84% here comes from the Association of American Universities, that 84% of those are increasing measures for effectiveness regarding those policies, those programs and interventions. One of the other pieces that I thought was a really important forward motion is that of those campuses that responded to the AAU survey, they really identified that campuses were doing a better job at gathering all of the information and all of the data that was on campus to make more nuanced, more informed decisions. And that is, of course, what we know is needed in order to move the needle on campus sexual assault. And we see through our sexual assault diagnostic inventory that most campuses are using the data that they're gathering in order to make informed decisions about the work that they're doing on campus. And I've identified here 5 of the 15 ways in which, the 5 most prevalent of the 15 ways that campuses are using information. 2 of those pieces, so campus-wide climate surveys and survey data from incoming in-person sexual assault prevention programs, are the 2 characteristics that for our campuses who have achieved advanced status in their sexual assault diagnostic inventory, that they share, that they're both engaging in campus-wide climate surveys, and they're using survey data from in-person sexual assault prevention programs, as well as those online sexual assault prevention programs. And so if you are someone who is using our Haven program and has not yet been able to dive into that rich body of data about your students that the Haven reports provide, I'd encourage you to reach out to your customer success representative to get some more information about how you can be using that data to really craft those effective programs on your campus. All right, so I'm gonna note here that a place where I think that we can do both celebration and retrench for more work. So again, of the AAU survey, we saw that 100% of those campuses have increased training for faculty and staff, which we know is needed and which we're happy to see. However, of those 100% of campuses who are increasing staff training, only 60% are actually assessing that those faculty have gained any information. It's really important to train faculty and staff and to assess the kind of additional work that needs to happen. And this is one of the reasons why. So this is data coming from our EVERFI Haven Faculty and Staff Survey from 2016. And you can see here that we're seeing enormous gains for faculty and staff who have taken this training, that they go from 12% understanding their reporting responsibilities on campus to 34% afterwards. A tremendous gain. Same for the confidentiality request, and just absolutely off the charts here for increasing faculty's confidence in being able to identify appropriate steps that they should take if a student discloses sexual assault to them. So all of these are really positive trends when we get that training to faculty and staff. And obviously, all of this data demonstrates that we need to be doing even more training with our faculty and staff in these important areas. And this is one of the reasons why. So looking here at breaking just this month, Nancy Camps-Talupo and William Kidder published some work on looking more specifically at the role of faculty in perpetration. And so their study identified that there are some myths as it relates to faculty perpetration, that sort of this benign idea that most faculty perpetration is verbal harassment in nature is not true, that most faculty who are harassing or assaulting students are engaging in that unwelcome physical contact, and that the majority of those who are engaging in unwelcome activity are doing so on a serial basis. So looking at training of our faculty and staff is also so important, because we want to create an environment not only with our students, but also with our faculty that sets the expectation for appropriate, respectful behavior, and that empowers individuals to step in when they see situations of harm. We're having those conversations with our students, and we also need to be having those conversations with faculty and staff. The information at the top of the slide here is from our EVERFI Campus Climate Survey, and it reflects that graduate students and professional students are twice as likely to identify that the person who caused them harm was a faculty member versus our undergraduate student population. So we also see that there's a disproportionate vulnerability to students experiencing harm at the hands of faculty if they're graduate and professional students. And so what is at stake here? I'm drilling down on faculty and staff training because I do think that this is absolutely the next horizon, the place where we need to do focus. And I want to recognize that it's a place where there are some long-standing institutional traditions that for some campuses providing or requiring their faculty to engage in training is a complex issue. But we know that when we don't have faculty and staff, and I'm thinking specifically of faculty here, ready to do their job, we have significant kinds of outcomes for students. So this is the information, and not only significant outcomes for students, but significant outcomes for institutions as well. So this is information that is coming from United Educators' report in 2017, a deeper dive of the original work that they did in 2013. And we're noting here that of the 1,000+ reports that they looked at as a part of their loss and claims analysis, there were about 10% of them that led to monetary loss. But of that 10% that led to monetary loss, we have a huge number of claims, number for claims paid out, 21.8%. So it has significant repercussions for campuses when we create responsibilities for faculty to report information or to respond to students in the classroom or another context, and don't ensure that they understand what their responsibilities are and that they're able to fulfill them in ways that are supportive of the student and also meet their institutional obligations. One last point about looking at that faculty and staff or learning divide. Oftentimes as practitioners, when we're thinking about that, how we're developing prevention programs, we pay a lot of attention to thinking about the ways in which our students learn, and we need to remember that our faculty and staff include diverse learners as well. And so I really encourage you, as you're beefing up those faculty and staff training programs, or perhaps launching them anew, that you're paying attention to thinking about all of the ways in which faculty and staff learn as well, both visual, auditory, through being able to think or write about something, and through movement. That all of these pieces are important, and that faculty groups and staff groups often have their own specific cultures, and that we need to be creating programming that reflects the cultural values, expectations of each of those groups, just as we would for our students. And that lastly moves us into programming. And so let's look at what we're seeing in terms of progress for programming. So we are doing a great job as a movement in looking at the ways in which we can reach student subpopulations. So 84% of campuses who responded to the AAU survey said that they did develop new programs, new educational initiatives or interventions for specific subpopulations. And for me, that is such a great forward motion progress. We are already seeing really great work at the universal population level, especially for those first-year students. Now we get the opportunity as a group of practitioners to look at what are we doing in terms of that selected group who may be at greater risk for experiencing harm or at greater risk for perpetrating harm, and what are we doing for those students who may have already experienced harm or may have already harmed another student. We see here that overwhelmingly we're reaching our first-year students, our resident assistants, our athletes, our leaders, our Greek life students, and there's great reasons for us to do so. Oftentimes we have better access to these students, but more importantly, those students are often, especially when we're looking at those student athletes, those student leaders, and those Greek students and those res ed students, opinion leaders on campus. And so reaching out to those students and making sure that we're giving them appropriate dosing is a really appropriate strategic approach. But we also know that there is more work. Whoops, I'm going to go forward. I'm going to go backwards here for a second. We know that there's more work to do in reaching those students who are not yet being reached as much. So our international students are not being reached as much. 33%. Our LGBTQ students and trans students are only being reached 25%. Our graduate students, 10%. These are students who are often most vulnerable to victimization. And so we have a lot more work to do in reaching out to those students. I think one of the real struggles is identifying or developing programs that are culturally appropriate. One of the things I'm very excited to note is that Dr. Sarah Rominsky and Michelle Monroe from the University of Michigan are going to be in the month of August doing a webinar with the Campus Prevention Network on using evidence-based adaptation processes to create culturally appropriate programs for specific populations. This is something that I think is going to be helpful for all campuses, thinking about how do you reach those specific populations, and also very specifically for our community college members, for our members of campuses that are on minority serving institutions or historically Black colleges or universities. We know that a lot of the work out there just has not been developed specifically with your student communities in mind, and so really encourage you to check out that webinar coming up in August, and we'll be having those invites going out soon. And now we are at the slide that I preemptively pulled up here. I wanted to note here that restorative justice, I think as it relates to programming, we've looked previously on more the primary prevention side of prevention here, and now I want to think about that, the ways in which restorative justice really is a part of, also that spectrum of prevention approach. Fueled in part by the voices of survivors who express that their needs are not met through either the criminal or the civil justice routes currently open, or the campus routes that are currently open, as well as hearing from those community members and practitioners who want more options for community accountability and for healing when these instances of violence occur in their communities. Restorative justice is one tool that is really beginning to gain momentum on campus as a possible avenue for culture change and transformation. I want to note here that there are some real barriers and some perceived barriers to restorative justice on campuses for sexual or intimate partner violence prevention. There is that prohibition of mediation in the Dear Colleague letters, and there's also justified concern and hesitation on the part of practitioners. I think that as we learn more about the ways that restorative justice can be used to prevent harm, to integrate students after they have experienced harm into the community, or after they have been held accountable for harm they committed back in their community, we see lots of options in addition to using restorative justice through a campus conduct process as appropriate. I encourage those of you who are interested in this work to check out the Campus PRISM website and to read their full report. And I'll note to everybody on the call that the deck that is going to be shared out with you after this webinar is going to also include full citations for all the work that I'm discussing here, so you have an opportunity to share this information. I want to sort of leave this idea on this note that restorative justice is absolutely about an opportunity for healing, student development, and community growth, which is, of course, at the heart of the work that we do. And I'm going to leave us at looking at our programming in the final minutes that we have here to think about the ways in which we are drilling down on that ongoing education component. So I've been so excited to hear the conversation starting with college campuses about mandatory education across the college experience. So as you saw on an earlier slide, 95% of campuses are in fact ensuring that those first-year students are receiving the opportunity for education on our campuses, and that also has a federal mandate associated with it. But we know that educational intervention wears off, and so starting to think about that sophomore, junior, and senior year on campus, I am excited about the emerging work that's happening. One of our prevention education, our Prevention Excellence Award winners, Dartmouth College, is embarking upon this project. If any of you else are on this webinar and you're also starting to look at ways that you can build out a 2-year, 3-year, or 4-year prevention program for your campus, I would love to hear from you and be able to connect you with other colleagues who are doing this work. I think this is exciting. It's something that we at EVERFI are thinking about a lot. We're working right now on building our ongoing sexual assault program to support this work that you're doing on campus. And what we see is that advanced institutions are delivering that in-person sexual assault prevention programs to their students 1 or 2 times per week. And so this is a variety of different kinds of interventions or opportunities available across many different modalities. But what we know is that, and you've heard this so many times, we know that the one and done is never enough. We also know that engaging with students in only their first year leaves them the last 3 years without our important guidance, support, intervention, and assistance in, again, creating those healthy relationships that all students need in order to thrive. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip our last poll and move straight to the path forward, because I want to leave a few minutes in order to share information. Actually, let me go, I apologize. I'm just going to go back. Oh, shoot, how do I, oh, here we go. I apologize. I'm going to go back for just 1 minute. I'm going to skip this poll. Michaela, please don't launch this poll. Unfortunately, we won't have time. I just want to note, though, legislative activity at the state level, increasing litigation by respondents to challenges to the preponderance, and also changes at the federal level. These are challenges that I anticipate is likely to impact the work of my colleagues across the country in the next year. One of the things that, as those of us who are looking at information and activity at the federal level with the Department of Education, that work that happens to those Dear Colleague letters, anything that may be happening going forward there, is unlikely to impact the way in which our prevention requirements are laid out. That just as a reminder to all of us in the field, that most of those prevention expectations, well, federal mandates, are embedded in the regulations and in the statute of the VAWA amendments to the Clery Act, and that those are not governed or connected to the Dear Colleague letters and other kinds of guidance that was issued by the Office for Civil Rights. And so even as we're seeing these changes potentially on the horizon in the next year, that those are unlikely to impact the expectations that are set forth in those VAWA amendments to the Clery Act, and is unlikely to change the work that we're doing on that level for prevention. All right, so going forward here in our final couple of minutes, I want to just, I love this image because for me, when I'm thinking about all the work that all of you are doing across the country to change the way in which our students experience their time on our campus, the way in which they graduate from our institutions and go off to have those meaningful, successful lives, I really do think about it as these sort of punctures of activity and excitement happening across the country, and that in fact it is a network. And so I hope that all of you on the webinar have had a chance to check out the Campus Prevention Network. This is an effort that we launched in April, and the Campus Prevention Network, which you see here, is really designed to support colleges and universities in driving that long-lasting, large-scale change on sexual violence prevention, intimate partner violence prevention, absolutely, but also the other issues that it really impacts that critical health, wellness, and safety needs of your students. And so if you're a community college member, a small private institution, if you're a part of a large public university, we have resources at the Campus Prevention Network that are really designed to support your work. And you've heard me refer a number of times to the Sexual Assault Diagnostic Inventory and some of the insights that we're gleaning from that inventory. I really strongly encourage everybody who is listening to this webinar to consider going to that Campus Prevention Network site, joining the network. You do so by taking a pledge. It is absolutely of no cost to your campus to join the network and have access to all of the resources that we have available there free of charge. We strongly encourage you to take that Sexual Assault Diagnostic Inventory. It is a tool that will help you benchmark your campus prevention efforts against what we see as the best practices in the field based on research. And be able to use that information, not only the data that you gather from your campus climate surveys, from the surveys following your Haven courses, but also your SADI diagnostic inventory information to be able to plan that next step forward. For me, that is the leaving of Oz moment, when we all have the ability to shape the future for our students in ways that are likely to yield that impact that we know that we can achieve and that our students deserve. And with that, I am at 2:58, and so it looks as though we're probably unlikely to be able to share questions, but we will get to all of your questions individually. And thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it back to you, Michele.
Hi, Holly. Thanks so much. That was an outstanding rerun of the presentation that you delivered last June. I was there in the audience. It was amazing to see you deliver it and see, in the months that have gone by, how current these considerations are and how pressing these issues continue to be. So thanks so much for presenting it to us again today. And I'm sure a lot of the people in the audience have appreciated and have connected to this perspective that you offered. And I think that's we've had a lot of questions that have come in, so we will be getting back to folks on those in the follow-up. But thanks to all of you who have been here today and have been engaged and have participated and have engaged with us through the questions as well. I'd like to remind everybody that, again, a copy of the slides and a full recording will be available to everyone after this event. And I'd also like to remind that as soon as you close out this event, a short poll on the quality of this webinar will initiate. If you could please take those 3 minutes to fill it in and provide us with your feedback, that would be great. Again, it's very much appreciated. Lastly, I'd like to remind you, to those of you who are still with us and are unfamiliar with EVERFI, we do provide a comprehensive training platform for Title IX and campus sexual assault and substance abuse prevention training for both students, faculty, and staff. So if you'd like to receive a demo of our courses and the overall online training platform, this is the moment to type demo in the question box. That would signal to us that you're interested in taking a tour of our solution and overall courses, and we'd love to show you around. So if you can type demo now, somebody will reach out to you and make sure that you are shown what we offer as a company to address a lot of these pressing issues that are out there in the real world. I'd like to thank everyone for this event. We've come at the hour after our start, so it is time for us now to switch off. But again, we're overwhelmed by the participation and the response that folks are having for these initiatives. So thank you so much for registering. Thank you for attending. And thanks to all of you, all those of you who keep writing in, saying that you've shared our invites with colleagues. You're definitely helping us extend our community and extend our discussion around these issues. So thank you again to all of you. We'll be obviously running a webinar next month as well, so stay tuned for that. You'll definitely be receiving a invite from me. And, thanks for being with us. Thank you, Holly. And I think we're done for today.